Karl Marx's personal life was a tapestry of profound contradictions, often standing in stark contrast to the grand theories he developed. For a man who dedicated his existence to dissecting the evils of capitalism and championing the working class, his own financial survival was ironically dependent on capitalist enterprise. He spent much of his adult life in dire poverty, frequently unable to afford basic necessities for his family. Yet, this hardship was consistently alleviated by the generosity of his close friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels. Engels, whose family owned a successful textile mill in Manchester, provided Marx with a steady stream of funds, effectively bankrolling the intellectual assault on the very system that generated his wealth. This reliance creates a difficult and often criticized image of the great anti-capitalist thinker. This financial arrangement has long fueled accusations of hypocrisy. Critics point out that while Marx was writing about the inevitable downfall of the bourgeoisie, he was living a life propped up by a member of that very class. He was not a factory worker sharing the plight of the proletariat, but a middle-class intellectual who, despite his poverty, maintained certain bourgeois sensibilities. His household, for instance, employed a lifelong housekeeper, Helene de Muth. This was a gift to his wife, Jenny von Westphalen, from her aristocratic mother. The presence of a servant in the home of a man decrying exploitation adds another layer of complexity to his personal story, making it easy for detractors to paint him as someone who failed to live by his own principles. The family struggles were not merely financial, they were deeply tragic and profoundly human. Forced into exile and constantly moving to escape political persecution, the Marx family lived a precarious existence in London. The squalid conditions and lack of consistent income took a devastating toll on their children. Of the 7 children Karl and Jenny had, only 3 daughters, Jenny, Laura, and Eleanor, survived into adulthood. The deaths of their other children, particularly their son Edgar from consumption, plunged Marx into periods of intense grief and despair. These personal losses reveal a side of Marx often overshadowed by his towering intellectual persona, that of a father enduring unimaginable sorrow, a man whose abstract theories were forged amidst the grim realities of personal suffering. Beyond the financial dependencies and domestic tragedies, Marx's personal conduct presented further contradictions. He was known to possess a domineering and quarrelsome personality, often driven by intellectual jealousy and a fiery temper. He engaged in bitter personal attacks against his rivals and was notoriously intolerant of those who dared to challenge his ideas. Furthermore, a significant personal secret shadowed his family life. He fathered an illegitimate son, Frederick, with the family housekeeper, Helene de Muth. To avoid a scandal that would destroy his marriage and reputation, Marx convinced Engels to claim paternity. Engels only revealed the truth on his deathbed, exposing a profound personal failing that complicates the image of Marx as a moral philosopher. While Karl Marx's philosophy championed the universal emancipation of humanity, his private writings contain language that is shockingly prejudiced and conflicts sharply with this ideal. In his personal letters, particularly those to Friedrich Engels, Marx frequently used racist and anti-Semitic slurs to denigrate his political opponents. One of the most infamous examples is his repeated verbal assault on Ferdinand Lassalle, a fellow German socialist. Marx, who came from a long line of Jewish rabbis, cruelly referred to Lassalle, who also had Jewish heritage, as a Jewish nigger. He wrote disparagingly about Lassalle's physical appearance, suggesting his features and hair proved he was descended from black people who had joined the flight from Egypt, a deeply offensive and bizarre outburst. This use of hateful language was not limited to one individual. Marx expressed disdain for various ethnic groups, at times referring to Russians as primitive cabbage eaters and dismissing entire Slavic populations as ethnic trash that history would rightly sweep away. These troubling statements reveal a disturbing prejudice that is difficult to reconcile with his broader vision of a classless society free from oppression. While some defenders argue that such language was more common in the 19th century, it nonetheless exposes a dark and intolerant side to his character. The man who wrote of breaking the chains of the oppressed was, in private, capable of deploying the very language of the oppressor, creating a profound and unsettling contradiction in his intellectual legacy. The most debated aspect of this issue is his 1844 essay on the Jewish question. This work remains a focal point of controversy, with scholars divided on whether it is an anti-Semitic tract or a complex piece of philosophical critique. In the essay, Marx associates Judaism with the debased world of commerce and huckstering. He controversially states, "Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist," and argues that the worldly religion of the Jew is bargaining. Critics argue that this text unfairly conflates Jewish identity with the worst aspects of capitalism, laying a theoretical groundwork for a modern economic form of anti-Semitism that would have devastating consequences later in history. However, supporters of Marx offer a different interpretation. They contend that On the Jewish Question is not an attack on Jewish people but a critique of the corrupting influence of commercial society on both Christians and Jews. In this view, Marx was using Judaism as a metaphor for the pervasive logic of capitalism, which he believed had saturated all of modern life. They argue that his goal was the emancipation of everyone, including Jews, from this system. Despite these defenses, the essay's specific focus and harsh language continue to make it a deeply problematic text. The debate over its intent highlights the difficulty in separating Marx's philosophical arguments from the prejudiced vocabulary he sometimes chose to express them. Karl Marx was not a gradual reformer. He was a revolutionary who believed that fundamental societal change could only be achieved through force. He was convinced that the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, would never voluntarily give up its power and privilege. Therefore, the working class, the proletariat, would have to seize it. This belief is famously and unambiguously stated in the conclusion of the Communist Manifesto, which declares that the communists' goals can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. This open call for violent upheaval has been one of the most contentious elements of his thought, providing a justification for armed struggle and civil war in his name for over a century. A far cry from peaceful political evolution. Central to his vision of this transition was the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. For Marx, this was a necessary, temporary phase after the revolution. During this period, the working class would wield absolute state power to suppress any counter-revolutionary efforts by the defeated bourgeoisie and to forcibly reorganize society along socialist lines. While Marx may have envisioned this as a form of rule by the majority, the term dictatorship itself is inherently authoritarian. This concept was later seized upon by leaders like Vladimir Lenin and twisted to justify the establishment of a one-party state, where the dictatorship of the proletariat became, in practice, the dictatorship of a small, elite group of party officials. Marx's intolerance was not just reserved for the capitalist class. He was also notoriously hostile toward other socialists who did not share his specific vision. He engaged in vicious polemics and political maneuvering to discredit and expel rivals from the International Workingmen's Association, the first major international socialist organization. His intellectual battles with figures like the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin and the French socialist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon were not just disagreements over theory, but bitter personal feuds. This authoritarian streak and demand for ideological purity revealed a man who was often unwilling to entertain dissent, a trait that critics argue is embedded in the very structure of his political project, foretelling the intolerance of later Marxist states. Perhaps one of the most surprising and controversial aspects of his thought was his qualified support for European colonialism. While he condemned the immense brutality and suffering inflicted by colonial powers, Marx also viewed it as a grim but necessary engine of historical progress. In his writings on British rule in India, for example, he argued that it was destroying stagnant Asiatic modes of production and, by introducing capitalism, was unintentionally laying the material foundation for a future socialist revolution. This perspective saw colonialism as a brutal but essential step in breaking down old societies to create the global capitalist system that would, in turn, give birth to its own gravedigger, the international proletariat. A core weakness in Karl Marx's body of work lies in its failed predictions. He famously theorized that communist revolutions would erupt in the most advanced industrial nations, such as Britain or Germany, where the contradictions of capitalism were most mature. He believed that the working class in these countries would become progressively poorer, a process he called immiseration, and would be driven by desperation to overthrow the system. History, however, took a very different path. The major Marxist-inspired revolutions of the 20th century occurred not in developed industrial heartlands, but in largely agrarian pre-industrial societies like Russia and China, a direct contradiction of his historical forecast and a significant blow to his theory's predictive power. Furthermore, the grim prediction of the immiseration of the proletariat did not come to pass in the way Marx envisioned. Instead of becoming poorer, the working classes in Western capitalist countries saw their living standards rise significantly throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries. The formation of trade unions, the implementation of social welfare programs, and the expansion of democratic rights gave workers a stake in the system, allowing them to improve their conditions through reform rather than revolution. This reality undermined a central pillar of Marx's argument, which depended on the idea that capitalism was incapable of providing long-term prosperity for the masses and would inevitably collapse under the weight of its own internal failures. Beyond failed predictions, critics of Marxist economics have pointed to a fundamental theoretical flaw known as the economic calculation problem. Thinkers from the Austrian school, in particular, argued that a centrally planned socialist economy, by abolishing private property and market-based prices, would be unable to rationally allocate resources. Without the price signals that emerge from supply and demand, planners would have no effective way of knowing what to produce, in what quantities, or how to do so efficiently. This, they argued, would inevitably lead to massive waste, chronic shortages, and economic chaos, a critique that seemed to be borne out by the struggles of the Soviet-style economies in the 20th century. Finally, the most haunting controversy surrounding Karl Marx is the undeniable link between his ideas and the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Governments claiming to be implementing his vision in the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, and elsewhere were responsible for tens of millions of deaths through purges, forced labor, and man-made famines. The debate rages on whether these atrocities a direct and logical outcome of his theories or a monstrous perversion of them. Critics argue that concepts like the dictatorship of the proletariat and the call for violent revolution created a blueprint for tyranny. Defenders insist that Marx, a humanist at heart, would have been horrified by these brutal states. This unresolved question ensures that his legacy remains both profoundly influential and deeply controversial.